On today's show, we're talking trades. We know that this is a topic that every basketball fan, specifically Bucks fans, like talking about. We need to run through some stuff here. What should the positional target be for this team? Then we get to the names, which is the exciting part for everyone. And then after that, when would a trade actually make sense? The Bucks are in an interesting position from a salary cap perspective. We project ahead to the next couple of summers and what that looks like. So we're going to try and break it all down and make some sense of the situation the Bucks find themselves in now. Let's get into
it. You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
You are locked on Bucks. My name's Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show and also find my work over at ESPN. And alongside me, the founder of brewhoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden, for today's episode that is brought to you by FanDuel. We thank everyone for making Locked On Bucks your first watch or first listen of every day. We're ramping up towards the regular season. We appreciate the support and lots of fun stuff on the show this week. Nick's crossover, our latest Damian Lillard chat, and now we're going to get into the trade targets as well. So if you've missed any of that, make sure you go back and listen to those shows and subscribe and drop a comment and like and get involved in the show and let us know what you want us to talk about because let's face it, we're in September. You guys are coming up with the topics for the show. But today, Frank, one that the listeners historically love, off-season, prime content. The roster's set right now. But it doesn't matter if the roster's set. People aren't satisfied when the roster's set. They want to know what else could potentially happen with this team, and particularly for a Bucks team that's in contention. We can go through all the different ways that the Bucks can look at potential deals, and we'll get into names and all those types of things. Maybe the best way to set the table here is to just talk about the timing of when a trade might make sense, some of the timings when it comes to when guys can actually be traded on the roster, and then additionally, next summer, the summer after, what it actually projects to look like, because that might give some clues into when the Bucks might be really pushing into making a big move.
Yeah, and I'm sort of looking at it really through the lens of the next year, right? And next year, we already know Giannis not signing an extension this fall, fine, whatever. No shocker there. But next summer is obviously where this becomes, a potential existential crisis if he says he's not willing to sign an extension. I think I think there's a very good argument for unless Giannis tells you that he's leaving or tells you that he wants a trade, a year from now, you just ride this out and say, we're going to put out all, we're going to spin the roulette wheel, whatever metaphor you want to use. And we're just going to make the most of these next 2 years. That's our window. That's when we've got our guys, and see what happens, right? And hope you can impress him that he wants to stay. But obviously, if he doesn't sign the extension, then everybody's going to try to figure out what that means. And does that mean that he wants to leave, blah, blah, blah. So I think the next year is obviously absolutely crucial. If you go out and just win a championship, hey, that's probably I think that's what the Bucks should do, Kane. I think that we can end the podcast. Bucks, our recommendation, win the championship next year. Probably would make the decision a bit easier for Giannis. But I think there's really in the next year, like these three kind of main times when sort of the optionality of what this roster could look like and, the implication for Giannis' future would be significant, right? I think it's, basically from when guys start to be trade eligible, either December 15th or January 15th, depending on when guys sign and their circumstances, to the trade deadline, right, in February. And then the other really key date this coming season, which is specific to the Bucks, is Jrue Holiday's extension eligibility. So he becomes eligible to sign an extension at late February of this coming year after the trade deadline. And, we haven't talked about it a whole lot, but look, for all of Jrue's foibles with his playoff shooting, he can opt out, right? He's got 2 years left on his contract, but the second year is a player option. So he can opt out next summer and become a free agent and go someplace else. He could have done that the year after the Bucks traded him, right? I mean, it's kind of funny to look back on it, right? Like that he was an expiring contract when the Bucks basically bet the farm on him with that huge trade. And so, last time they were in this position, they were able to extend him. If they don't extend him this time, doesn't mean that they won't be able to re-sign him in the summer. But but if you get to next summer, which is the next major date, right? Trade deadline, Drew's extension eligibility, and then next summer. If you were to leave next summer, again, say what you will about Drew, he's going to be turning 34 next June, but from a talent perspective, how you replace Drew Holiday just walking out the door, I don't know that you can, guys. Like, you're gonna have to cash in that, by next summer you'll have the 2029 and the 2031 first rounder that you can put into play. So, but still, that gets real scary if you're having to not only upgrade the roster with what you have over what you have now, but you're also having to fill a Drew Holiday sized hole in your backcourt. So I would just frame it that way. And I personally, Chris Middleton becomes trade eligible December 15th. Brook Lopez becomes trade eligible January 15th. Again, that's just because Brook got a raise that puts him in a kind of different group. I personally, I just don't really foresee a scenario unless it's like, again, knock on wood, some disaster scenario. I have a hard time seeing a scenario where one of those guys gets traded during this season. I think that they're, again, unless there's like problems in the underlying relationships, Giannis's commitment thing becomes a real thing or something like that. I don't think it's out of the question that one of those guys would get moved a year from now, next summer, if things don't work out in the playoffs and you fall, short again, and you have to kind of try to shake things up. But I think I feel pretty confident they're going to stick with the kind of core group through this coming season. So as we talk about like trade options and things like that, I think really big trades, i.e. trades involving Chris or Brook, again, I'm putting Drew aside because he's likely going to be a free agent or having just signed an extension next summer. I'll put him aside for now. He was the one guy we were talking about this summer because he was not a free agent, whereas the other guys were, and it'll kind of flip next summer. So when I've been thinking about trades, I've been thinking about, kind of like additive trades, i.e. using those Grayson Allen, Connaughton, Portis, and the future first round pick type contracts, contracts and assets, kind of making a play sometime, from now until next trade deadline. Like, those are the types of trades I'm thinking about between now and next February. And then a year from now, next summer, then I think a lot more potentially comes into play. I mean, who knows, right? Like, if Giannis, God forbid, demands a trade, right? Like, you're looking at a whole different universe of things that you'd have to consider. But that's sort of the way I'm thinking about it. So, again, I know you just talked about Damian Lillard, right? Like, again, like, hard to see the Bucks making a legitimate play for Damian Lillard now, given the asset base. But that said, like, I think a year from now, especially if desperation kicks in and you're, if things go poorly and you're willing to put Chris Middleton into a deal or Brook Lopez or whatever it might be, I think there may be some like veteran type guys. Where will Zach LaVine and the Bulls be? Who knows, right? Where will Paul George and the Clippers be? Who knows, right? I mean, again, like, those are kind of glitzy names. Brad Beal, we know that Giannis was interested in Brad Beal multiple times, and I think pushed for the Bucks to maybe look at that this summer, and they kind of did, but didn't really have any kind of obvious path to that. Again, if the Suns fall short, maybe that would be something that you could explore next summer. So I think there's some bigger names that you could look at next summer, but I think between now and the trade deadline, I think it's much more of the, let's combine our, nickels and dimes and see if we can get a quarter or a 50-cent piece.
I think, that timing does make sense. And we did discuss, certainly on the Lillard podcast, that it seemed on the more unlikely scale of things. But if you're a Bucks fan right now, let us know where you've got the panic meter, because I think that's where it's at. Right now, this Bucks team should feel pretty comfortable that they've got a roster that can be very, very competitive in the Eastern Conference and give themselves a chance to win. A year down the track, when maybe there is elevated panic or concern about losing Giannis, maybe that's when things start to happen. And also, just because right now, with those trade dates that you mentioned as well, it seems hard to believe that the Bucks could get in the mix for Damian Lillard without maybe a third team or something like that. So that's where it stands right now. So if you are talking about additive trades, that is still enough to get people excited, because I think that a lot of Bucks fans are looking at this roster and saying, well, okay, we think that we might be one guard away. We might be one scorer away. So let's get to some of the names next because I've got your spreadsheet up here and I'm looking forward to running through that. But first, FanDuel, today's sponsor of the podcast. Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options that include the spreads, the player props, over and unders, and more as well. And I'm just looking at the Packers. They get a home game this weekend. It's unbelievable. But they do play the Saints right now, giving up 2 points to the Packers there. So they are the favourites in this game, which you'd love to see. You'd love to see them go 2-1 with a win here, or certainly a lot of our listeners would. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. That's FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, as I mentioned, hang on, I'm putting up every single sponsor board down the bottom of this show. Shout out to all those lovely sponsors. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you check them all out. Check out the other episodes of Locked On Bucks, Damian Lillard, Locked On Knicks crossover as well. Plenty of fun stuff this week. And subscribe, drop a comment, like, and do all those things to help support the show because it's free to do. And it does help us along the way. Let's get to some of the names. I've got your spreadsheet up here, and that's why it makes it very easy when I podcast with you, Frank. I think because there are a lot of names that potentially Bucks fans will be excited at, but I think for the most part, when we've discussed these names over the last couple of months, we have looked at the guys in the, let's say 14 to 22 million, maybe pushing it a little bit, but around that range. So you've got a spreadsheet here with the names and the salaries. Out of all those guys in that range, and you can go through, and Colin Sexton, who we've discussed a lot, Bogdan Bogdanovic, who, let's face it, the Bucks deserve to have him at some point in time while he's still functional, coming off a monster FIBA World Cup, by the way. He's a name that we see a lot in the YouTube comments. Terry Rozier has been a guy we spoke about in the past. He's at 23 million. But where do you want to start? Because those three guys do have something in common. They're guards. And I think a lot of Bucks fans will be pointing to that position on the floor as maybe where the depth isn't at its greatest.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, there's like two archetypes that when I think about team needs, right? The way the roster is currently constructed, there's sort of two general player types that I think would make the most sense, that could be the most additive to the roster looking ahead to next spring and playoffs and trying to compete for a championship. I think one is some sort of scorer, creator, combo guardish perhaps player. Again, like Sexton is a guy that obviously we've talked about it for a bit this summer. I think the interesting thing about it, if you look at those types of players, there's a lot of actually younger guys in there too. So Sexton's obviously on the young side. Anthony Simons, right? Like I don't know what Portland's plans are, moving forward. Even if they trade Dame, Simons may be a bit, surplus to requirements there. He's making about 24 million a year. Lights out 3-point shooter, defensive question mark. And there's some other guys too, like some guys that are not on huge contracts yet, guys that will need to be paid. I think the two guys that jump out to me most there are Immanuel Quickley from the Knicks, a guy that didn't play well in the playoffs last year, had some injuries, but I think has been just a really well-rounded guard. Again, not as glitzy a scorer as a Sexton or a Simons, but does a little bit of everything. And his team defensive skills, I think, have been way beyond certainly what most of these other guys that we've been discussing are. So Quickley, I think, is really interesting. And, again, I don't think the Knicks are going to look to give him away. I think they would probably say like, oh, we want to keep him and then use him in a trade for Giannis, a year from now. It's like, whatever. But if you could get your hands on him, he's been a sixth man, he's been a starter. I think the beauty of having a Drew Holiday on your roster is you can, again, you can play a traditional shooting guard, or you can play another ball handler, combo guard type guy, and I think it could actually work really well. Or you could bring that guy off the bench, whatever you might want to do. So I like Quickley, and then the other guy that I like a lot, kind of in that mold, is Andrew Nembhard from Indiana. And I don't think the Pacers are, looking to trade him by any stretch. He had a really solid rookie year. I don't think he's a high ceiling guy by any stretch, but he's a big kind of point guardish, combo guardish type guy. He's obviously young, very cheap right now for better or worse. And has really intriguing defensive tools and is a guy that not a top shelf athlete, not a guy that necessarily is ever going to be, getting to the rim and scoring at high volumes, but a guy that just plays with an ease and a calmness on both ends that I think would lend itself very well to playoff basketball. And again, maybe he's a 10.4 assist guy or something like that, but the two-way play, the ability to complement the guys you already have, I think is really intriguing. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not really sure like what, Indiana would be expecting from him. I don't think there's really, he started a fair bit last year, but given the other guys that Indiana has, like, are they really wanting to start him? They still have TJ O'Connell in the backcourt as well. Some of the other kind of like, again, I'll skew towards some of the younger guys. I mean, there are like the Terry Rozier types out there, which, Terry Rozier, very expensive, older. The Terry Rozier experience may be a bit more than any of us are quite ready for. But other guys that are out there that fit in that kind of guard category, Orlando. I mean, Markelle Fultz. I don't know. I don't think Markelle Fultz is necessarily a great compliment to Giannis, but he's an intriguing talent, really, especially when you look at it as like a two-way type player. And then Cole Anthony. I have never been a big Cole Anthony fan, to be honest, but I have to admit he actually has like gone places the last couple of years, been more efficient, become a more efficient player than I thought he'd be. Has decent size. Again, I look at him more as like a 6-man type guy, maybe, but again, like for this Bucks roster, we saw what happened in the fourth quarters of those last two games in the playoffs, and it was not pretty. So just having another guy that can be kind of that like, offensive juice would be interesting. And then I think just two other guards, maybe not as sexy to some, but Tyus Jones and DeLon Wright are sort of in purgatory with the Washington Wizards. Tyus Jones, I would say, a higher end player than DeLon Wright.
Certainly overpaid by the spreadsheet, by the way.
Yeah, we got an extra zero in there. $14 million is what he's making next year. Cheap by starting point guard standards if you think he's a starter. But again, not a very big guy. Not a great high volume 3-point shooter, but just a really steady player. And DeLon Wright, probably even more so, right? Just like never been a high volume 3-point shooter, but just kind of like does stuff, good two-way player. He's a bit older. So again, not sexy, but again, like what does it take to get a DeLon Wright? It's not going to take a 2029 first round pick, let's say, right? So there's kind of like a big range of potential guys there. I think the other archetype is the wing stopper position. And to me, this kind of gets at the idea of you're playing the Boston Celtics. Who guards Jason Tatum? Well, it's not PJ Tucker. It's not Wes Matthews. I really hope Chris Middleton's surgically repaired knee makes him a bit sprightlier on defense. But looking at the way the team is constructed with, at least as of now, like Grayson Allen is the incumbent shooting guard, Chris coming back at the 3 and Giannis at the 4, there's really not like a natural kind of like wing stopper type guy to play there. So unless Marjon Beauchamp comes out and, balls out in this coming season, which I don't know that I'm banking on that from a playoff perspective, I think you have a potential need there. And so there's a whole slew of guys that, again, whether they're a little bit bigger or more kind of like 2-3 sized, you can't have enough of that type of talent. And so there's definitely guys there, whether it's, Dorian Finney-Smith is probably the most obvious guy. He's making $14 million a year for the Nets. What are the Nets doing? Who knows? They also have Royce O'Neal, who's probably would be a bit cheaper at a little under $10 million. And then you've got sort of like, different flavors of positions of guys that are maybe bringing a little bit of that more kind of like wing defensive type of mold, right? Alex Caruso, obviously fraught history with the Bucks. but a total weirdo because he's like point guard size, but he can defend up and, is an all defensive caliber guy. I would love to have Alex Caruso starting next to Drew Holiday. I don't know if they would make a shot in the playoffs, but they may not allow their opponents to make a shot either. And then you have, guys like, young guy like KJ Martin, right? Like I was surprised how little it took to get him from the Rockets to send him to the Clippers. Norm Powell on the other side of the sort of age spectrum. I think Norm's 30 now, makes $18 million a year, is not cheap, but Norm Powell also Bucks killer, solid defender. So that would be kind of a different type of player. And then, a guy like Reggie Bullock, who, all he does is shoot threes on offense, and he's a very solid defender. He's not like a big guy, but he's now in San Antonio, right? And he seems like the kind of guy the Spurs might be open to shopping, right, at the trade deadline. So again, just different types of guys, but just I think that's an area where, not to say that any of those guys are, stopping Jason Tatum. I think Finney Smith is probably the one guy out of that group that you might say like start him and put him on Jason Tatum and you feel like okay about it. But again, just looking at kind of the structure of the current roster, just the lack of sort of proven defensive wings does make me, a bit nervous. So again, that's an area I think, they always say you can never have too many kind of those big wings in the playoffs. And so again, is that a way that an area that the Bucks may look to kind of use some of that precious asset currency on? Maybe. So let me pause there. I mean, Kane, I know we've kind of talked about it, like where are you at in terms of at least positional need? Like do you swing more towards let's get a guard who can create, or do you feel like, hey, we need more size, more defense, more toughness for the playoffs on the wing?
So I think, and it's kind of interesting looking at last year's playoffs, particularly in the fourth quarter when the Bucks just got absolutely smoked by Jimmy Butler. Like that can probably tilt the way you're looking at this a little bit.
It probably would have been better to use Jimmy Butler as like the who's stopping X guy.
Tatum,
right?
Butler,
pretty much the same types of players you'd probably pick. Yeah.
No, but that's exactly right. We saw Tatum the year before, so let's be honest. We're just parlaying our playoff disappointments here at this point on Locked On Bucks. But to me, I'm still looking at the offensive side of the ball and perimeter scoring and not necessarily creation for others. I think there's enough of that. But being able to get your own shot would be pretty handy. Now, of course, again, if you look at the last two postseasons, and Milton, not really himself last year, although he was pretty damn good in that series from a scoring perspective, but the year before he wasn't there. So I still think another guy like that makes sense. I think the biggest question for me, and we can get into some of these names in just a second, but the biggest question for me is the 2029 pick, and is the value significantly increased right now with other teams who are maybe sniffing blood in the water? And for the Bucks, does that make you more likely to want to trade it and cash in, or does it make you nervous about the future? I think that's a fascinating question for this Bucks team. I want to get into that a little bit next after we talk about Jace Medical, another sponsor of today's podcast. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected, and that's why Jace Medical offers the Jace case. The Jace case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use and gives you peace of mind so that you are not just hoping you have access to medication in an emergency. Jace Medical makes sure you have the medication in hand. It's simple. They handle everything from the online evaluation to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation throughout. So don't get caught underprepared. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using code LOCKEDON at the checkout on jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, promo code LOCKEDON.
By the way, I need to, for those watching on YouTube, I'm wearing a Bucks, like a
purple,
an
champion.
Old school. Well, here's the thing. This looks purple in this lighting. Or does it look purple to you too? This is a black shirt, but I have a purple version of this shirt that I wore earlier this week. And I got these shirts from friend of the pod, Andy Grozalski, when we had our Locked On Pod live, Locked On Bucks live pod. Andy hooked me up with a couple of these. He just like makes these shirts. He just finds old logos and puts them on shirts for himself and his friends. He gave me one from like an 80s Bucks logo. at like 3 a.m. out of the trunk of his car the night the Bucks won the championship. So that's one of my favorite shirts. And he hooked me up a little bit more. So shout out to Andy, longtime Bucks super fan. He's the one he organized the whole Mecca floor art exhibit. He runs Mondo Lucha every year. He's just a man about town. So shout out to Andy. But anyway, trade targets, Kane.
Trade targets, and this hat right here, but US Open, by the way. This is black. You are wearing purple. You're wearing purple, my friend. I'm not going to be able to convince anyone.
I'm gonna take a picture and send it to you. This is like the dress thing that nobody could agree on the color of, I guess, a couple years ago.
So if you asked me about positional targets, those types of things, and that's where I come into the question with the 2029 first, because it's still a long way in the future. I know the years that you look and you say 2029 is closer than you think. We're heading into the 2024 season, which sounds bizarre, but it's still a fair way off. So again, that is why a team might say, okay, this is a very attractive pick to us. We can have that. But if you look at some of those names that you had on the board, because what I'm seeing in the YouTube comments is a lot of excitement about Colin Sexton, Bogdan Bogdanovic, maybe to a lesser extent, Bojan Bogdanovic, although we spoke about him a little bit last season around the trade deadline. Would the Bucks be interested in making a move there? To me, though, well, either Bogdanovic.
He's Bojan's just so old. Like that's the part. It's like, man, like I'm looking at this roster and I'm like, how do we get like, how do we get guys that are at least like younger than slightly younger than our core guys? I'm not necessarily saying we find like a 24-year-old superstar or something, because I know that's not, behind door number one, but just like, can we not cash in the 2029 first for, a 35-year-old guy like that? That would make me a bit nervous, right? So let me say this. I think the litmus test that I run when I think about using that 2029 first, because I think there's a natural like urge to say like, well, just get somebody good, right? Just get somebody who's going to help you, like somebody is going to play in the playoffs. Like that would be obviously like the minimum, right? Like don't give the 2029 first for a guy that like you're not sure if he's going to be in the 8-man rotation in the playoffs, right? Like the Jay Crowder problem. But I think you have to hold it to a higher standard. I mean, it's again, that is like, I don't say it's your last chip, because next summer on draft night, the Bucks can take their 2024 first round pick. They can't trade it officially in advance, but they can basically work out a deal where they say like, hey, who do you want? We'll pick that guy for you, and then we'll trade it to you after the draft, and that doesn't, violate any of the trading future first round pick. So again, on draft night next summer, they could trade the 2024 plus, if they still have the 2029, plus the 2031 pick also comes into play starting in July, basically. So you could do a deal where you completely, mortgage, again, like I always joke about, we're going to be dead by the time these picks convey, but we'll really be dead by the time those picks convey. So yeah, I mean, you could go all in, right? Like Drew Holiday trade part 2, and make that big swing trade next summer on draft night, right? Or sort of free agency. But you do not have that same ability, right? You can only trade the 2029 first, leading up to the trade deadline this year. So your asset stockpile is a bit different, right? I mean, you could break it up too, right? You could use the 2029 first and then use those other 2 picks later. But I would say the thing that I think about when we're talking about trading these picks, like if you're just talking about one future first, look, you're not getting a second best player on a championship team with that pick. I'm not under any illusion of that. And you're probably not getting a third best player, certainly not the third best player on next year's, hopeful championship team. That said, I think especially if you're looking at the younger players that we've been talking about, if you make a gamble, if you take an upside swing, I think you at least want to be using that type of draft capital. I think you at least want to be able to tell yourself that that guy you're trading for could be maybe the third banana if things go well, right? Not necessarily the third banana right away, right? Like Colin Sexton, like, man, expecting Colin Sexton to be the third banana on a championship team next year, like that's a lot. But But again, is there a guy out there? I don't know that there is, right? I don't know if there is a guy that you can get with just that pick and contracts, right? Bobby, Pat, Grayson, whatever. But that's partly why you don't trade it until you maybe do have a better belief in that. So that's sort of the way I've been thinking about it, is like, do you if you're going to use that type of draft capital, are you getting a guy that you can see being Giannis's running mate and kind of helping bridge this team to the afterlife of the current core four, which again is like, that's the holy grail, is finding a way to compete beyond, the next couple of years when Brooke in particular, Chris, Drew are going to decline. And again, that is not going to be easy, and it may not be particularly feasible without a whole lot of luck. But that's kind of the job for John Horst at this point, right? Is maximize the next 2 years, and then give yourself a chance to keep going beyond that.
So I would probably, and now again, this doesn't necessarily fit the age profile. And if I go through some of the names you mentioned on the sheet again, which is looking at guys that, as you've got here, upside swing, whether it's Kuminga, Cole Anthony, it's hard to see the Bucks making that trade this year, because you feel if they're making a trade that is significant, it is a guy, as you pointed to, that he's going to be in your 6-7 man rotation in the postseason. Now, are those guys there? They weren't last year. Well, the Orlando Magic didn't make it. Kuminga wasn't in it really for the Warriors.
Yeah.
So, but Bogdan Bogdanovic, so that's the point. I agree with you. Bojan is too old at this point. That would feel like an underwhelming use of your potentially your sole asset. But Bogdan, so he's just turned 31. He came to the NBA late. He's been a professional for a long time. So he's definitely got miles on the legs. But he hasn't got 10 plus years of NBA miles on his legs. And I don't know. The knees and stuff have been a bit of a problem in Atlanta. So he's had some injuries. So it's not without risk. But I still feel like he's been kind of underutilized in the NBA. Now, it's a very different game. But we've seen it time and time again, whether it's 2019 with Serbia, 2023. Now, Patty Mills does this for Australia. So that's the counter to this point. But he is a dominant player. He is a guy that I think, if you look at the scorers and you say, well, okay, do I really trust Drew Holiday based on what we've seen as a scorer in the postseason? It's hard. He's had moments, but clearly the efficiency hasn't been there. Middleton, you trust. Giannis, you trust. Honestly, you trust Brook Lopez. But I think you need another guy. And I would believe that Bogdanovic could be that guy. You're not asking him to be the second best player on the team. The other thing that helps with him is the contract is pretty friendly. 18 mil this year, 17 next year, 16 the year after, and then a team option at 16 mil for 2027. That's a pretty fair deal for a guy that I think is a pretty impactful player. So you might say, as you pointed to, let's wait till next off season, because maybe you can really make a big swing, and maybe you regret using the 2029 pick. But that is a guy that I could say, okay, I understand it, and I think it can help you win a title this year.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we mentioned at the top, right? There is a list of guys that Giannis likes.
Yeah.
Who, if you acquire one of those guys, you increase the probability of Giannis staying. And, again, I think Bradley Beal's on that list. Bogdan Bogdanovic was at one point. Whether he still is, like, kind of an open question, but my guess is, like most players, they tend to have sort of like their sticky list of guys they like, and maybe they typically hang on a little bit longer than they should as far as their opinions of guys. And looking at Bogdan's playoff history, he struggled. He had the knee problems that first year. I mean, thank God, by the way, the Bucks beat the Hawks. Like, the scenario where Bogdan, you don't sign, you don't get him, and then he comes back to haunt you and somehow beats you in the playoffs. Like, that was just, that was truly like never trust the Bucks, old Bucks, sad sack type nightmare energy. So
it's actually the anti-Bucks to think about. So, because that trade didn't go through, they win the title anyway.
Yeah.
And then 3 years later, they win a title, and Bogdan Bogdanovic is the key in-season trade piece. It's a great story. It's a book.
Yeah. I mean, and again, like since that playoff run, I mean, they've only he wasn't he's had like a 49% true shooting that playoff run. He wasn't great.
Yeah.
Again, was dealing with the injuries. But the two since then, he was better. 53% true shooting in the 21-22. He's shot really well in the series last year that they lost against the Celtics. He was like 70% true shooting. So I mean, again, FIBA Bogdan is not necessarily a guy we're ever going to see, but I've always liked him. Again, not a great defensive player by any stretch, but he's frisky. It's funny. I think back to him. I went to a Kings Bucks game, and he got matched up on Giannis a few times on switches, and he was just like he knew that he could just foul the shit out of Giannis like off the ball basically when he was posting up. So he was like really aggressive, and I was just like, well, Bogdan, it's frisky, right? So I don't know. I mean, we don't have to belabor that anymore, but it's funny. Like especially when they traded for Murray, I just sort of thought like, are they really gonna pay, give Bogdan another bag? But they obviously, extended him, and his contract's slightly lower now than it was. He literally just turned 31 years old, and he's on a declining contract. He's going to make shade under 19 this year, and then 17, 16, and 16 club option on the last year. So I mean, the contract is, especially in an escalating cap environment, like by the 25-26 year, you're talking about 10% of the total league cap. So pretty modest, at that point. But again, the question there is like, he'll be 33 in 25-26. Is he a guy that's sitting out a lot of games because his knee is bad or whatever it might be? But yeah, Bogdan, I always found him intriguing. And again, though, are you willing to give up a 2020 first round pick for it? That's a bit tough.
It's team chemistry, Frank. You just have a whole roster full of guys with dodgy knees. It's something to bond over.
Maybe you can get a deal on knee cleanups, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Buy two, get the third free or something like that. You already got Chris and Giannis this summer. Maybe you can maybe Bogdan can get a free one next summer if the Bucks get him.
That's right. So something to think about, particularly for a team that's in the repeat attacks. You got to save those pennies where you can. So maybe that's something they can do there. Shall we wrap this up?
Let's do it.
All right. So let us know what you think. Lots of names that we've mentioned in this podcast. And obviously at the back end, we discussed Bogdan Bogdanovic a lot. So give us specifically your thoughts. Is that something you'd be willing to part with the 2029 pick? And that pick, as we've discussed, could be used now potentially on perhaps a smaller scale trade, or maybe you can hold on to it and try and take a larger swing next offseason when maybe things are going to ramp up a little bit. So let us know what you would do if you were the Bucks. I would say generally in this situation, patience is not at a premium when it comes to trades. So I'm curious to see what everyone thinks about the Bucks situation and what they should do. Mentioned it a few times, but plenty of good podcasts this week from Damian Lillard specifically to the New York Knicks as well. At some point, I keep mentioning it, we're going to lock in a date, but you've got to turn the notifications on and subscribe. We'll do a live podcast, and then all these topics we've discussed, you can jump in the chat and fire away your thoughts and opinions there as well. So we'll lock in the time for that. If you're subscribed, I'll put it up. We'll put it on Twitter, and you'll know when we're going to do that. So we'll leave it there for today, and we'll speak to you guys tomorrow.